My wife cheated on me for 6 months. Her parents knew and planned to steal my fortune. But the prenup they forced me to sign destroyed them all. I'm 38 years old. I run a pretty successful property management business in Denver, and I need to tell this story because basically what happened last year showed me that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who stab you in the back, the hardest, and all for money. The thing is that when I was young, like 23 years old, I had no idea that signing a paper was going to end up saving my life years later. But here we are. I met Valerie at a mutual friend's barbecue. I was 23 and she was 22, fresh out of college and working as an elementary school teacher. I was working in it at the time, making like $40,000 a year, nothing special, living in a small apartment in Denver, and basically making enough to pay the bills and maybe go out to eat once in a while. Valerie was pretty, sweet. We had a lot in common, or so I thought, and we started dating. The first few weeks were perfect, One of those relationships where everything flows well and you think you found the right person. About 2 months into dating, I met her parents, Dennis and Maria, and that's when things started getting weird. They lived in Boulder in this huge house, like one of those houses you see in magazines, with mountain views and everything. Dennis owned several car dealerships in Colorado. I don't remember exactly how many, but it was quite a few. And Maria had a boutique in downtown Boulder that, according to her, was more of a hobby than a real business. From the first moment they met me, they looked at me like I was some kind of bug. With that attitude of, who is this guy and what is he doing with our daughter? The dinner was awkward. Dennis asked me like 1,000 questions about my job, my career plans, my finances, and I was there trying to sound impressive, when the reality is, I was making $40K a year and living in a one-bedroom apartment. Valerie and I kept dating. Things were going well between us, despite her parents clearly not being thrilled about the relationship. She always told me not to worry, that eventually her parents would accept me, but I felt like every time we visited them, Dennis looked at me like he was calculating how much I was worth on the market. Valerie also had a younger sister, Kristen, who was like 19 at the time and was the only one in the family who was genuinely nice to me without conditions. She was always funny and laid back, completely different from her parents. After 2 years of dating, I proposed to Valerie. I had saved up to buy her a decent ring, nothing fancy but nice, and she said yes. I was happy, I thought I was finally going to have a real family because my own parents had died in a car accident when I was 19, and I had basically been alone since then. But when we announced the engagement to her parents, Dennis and Maria didn't say congratulations or anything like that. Instead, Dennis pulled me aside and told me we needed to talk about some practical matters before the wedding. The week later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office in Boulder, Dennis and Maria on one side of the table, me on the other, and the lawyer sliding a prenuptial agreement toward me. Dennis explained to me, with that condescending voice he always used, that it was important to protect family assets, and that since Valerie would eventually inherit part of the family business, they needed to make sure everything was in order. I sat there looking at the document, not knowing what to say, feeling the size of an ant, because basically they were telling me I wasn't good enough for their daughter and they needed to protect her from me. Maria added, with a fake smile, that it wasn't personal, that it was just common sense, and that if I really loved Valerie, I would understand. I signed the prenup because what else was I going to do? If I didn't sign it, obviously there would be no wedding, and I loved Valerie, or at least I thought I did. The agreement basically said that if we divorced, each of us kept what we had, no matter how long we were married. But at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal, because I had nothing. Literally zero. So I thought, well, I'm not losing anything by signing this. What did hurt was the way they made me feel, like I was a gold digger or something, when the reality is I just wanted to marry their daughter. We got married 6 months later. It was a big wedding in Boulder that Valerie's parents paid for completely. I couldn't contribute practically anything, and that made me feel even worse. Dennis took every opportunity during the wedding to subtly remind me that he was paying for everything, making comments like, "Oh, Patrick, I hope you're enjoying the party. It cost quite a bit to organize." Those kinds of things that make you feel like garbage. But anyway, I was married to Valerie, and I thought things were going to get better. That eventually her parents were going to accept me. The first years of marriage were okay. Not perfect, but not terrible. Either. Valerie kept working as a teacher, making like $35,000 a year. I was still in it, but had gotten a better job making $55,000, and we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Denver. We didn't have a lot of money, but we got by. We went out to dinner once in a while, took small trips, a normal middle-class life. Valerie's parents kept treating me condescendingly, but I had learned to ignore it, more or less. The thing that changed everything was that at my job, which was a software startup, they offered me stock options as part of my compensation. This was like 4 years into being married. I was 27 years old. And honestly, I didn't think much about those options because startups almost never amount to anything, right? But I accepted the options because why not? They didn't cost me anything, and maybe someday they would be worth something. During those years, I worked like crazy. Not just at my IT job, but also doing freelance work at night and on weekends. Basically anything to make extra money because I wanted to prove to Valerie's parents that I wasn't a loser. 5 years after they gave me those options, when I was 32 years old, the startup was acquired by a big tech company. My stock options were suddenly worth like $800,000. Literally overnight, I went from having basically nothing to having almost $1 million. I couldn't believe it. Valerie couldn't believe it. Nobody could believe it. I used part of that money to invest in real estate, bought some rental properties, and with what was left over, I decided to quit my IT job and start my own property management business. The business took off faster than I expected. Turns out I had a talent for it, and in 3 years I was already managing like 50 properties in the Denver area and making around $200,000 a year. Valerie kept working as a teacher, but not out of necessity anymore. She said she liked it, and we moved to a nice house in a nice Denver suburb. For the first time in my life, I felt successful. You know? Like I had finally achieved something. And this is where things get interesting. Because suddenly Dennis and Maria started being super nice to me. Dennis would call me to ask for investment advice, Maria would invite me to lunch to ask about the real estate market, and Valerie was happy that her family was finally accepting me. I was naive. I thought I had finally earned their respect, that they had seen I wasn't the loser they thought I was. But looking back, I should have seen it coming. The change was too sudden, too convenient. Everything exploded like a year and a half ago. I was 37 years old at the time. We were at a family dinner at Valerie's parents' house. One of those Sunday dinners they had every month. And after dinner, Dennis asked me to go to his study to talk business. I thought he was going to ask me for more investment advice or something, but instead he told me that he and Maria had been thinking about the prenuptial agreement and that it no longer made sense. He explained that when we signed that agreement, I had nothing, and now things were different, that we had been married for over 10 years, that we were a family, and that it was time to eliminate that document. I told him I would think about it because something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. But Dennis insisted, said there was nothing to think about, that it was obvious the agreement no longer applied to our current situation. Maria joined the conversation, saying that keeping that agreement was like saying I didn't trust Valerie, that after so many years of marriage it was an insult to still have that paper in effect. I told them I would talk to Valerie and we would see, but the truth is their insistence seemed suspicious to me. When we got home that night, Valerie brought up the subject immediately, told me her parents were right, that the prenup was ridiculous at this point, and we should dissolve it. I asked her why it was suddenly so important after 11 years of marriage, and she got angry, accused me of not trusting her, of wanting to protect my money in case we got divorced, and I was there trying to explain that wasn't it, but that I simply didn't see the urgency of changing something that had been established for over a decade. We had our first big fight that night. She went to sleep in the guest room and I stayed awake trying to understand what was happening. The next few months were hell, basically. Valerie and her parents wouldn't stop pressuring me about the prenup. Every family dinner ended with Dennis or Maria mentioning it. Valerie would cry and tell me I was ruining our marriage over a stupid piece of paper. And I felt like the bad guy in the movie. Kristen, Valerie's sister, was the only one who didn't say anything about it. In fact, I noticed that every time the family started pressuring me, she got uncomfortable and tried to change the subject. Things reached a peak when one Saturday I came home, after checking on one of my properties and found Valerie's entire family in my living room. Dennis, Maria, Valerie, Kristen, and even an uncle of Valerie's I didn't even know. Well, we're sitting there like it was an intervention. Dennis spoke first. Said they had decided to have this family meeting because the prenup issue had gone too far and it was time to resolve it. Maria added that they were all worried about our marriage and that I was the only one who could fix the situation by doing the right thing. I felt ambushed. Literally. Because nobody had told me they were going to be there. Valerie was crying, saying I didn't love her, that if I loved her I would trust her and eliminate that horrible agreement her father had forced me to sign, and I'm thinking, wait, now it turns out the agreement they forced me to sign is my fault? I told everyone I needed time to think about it, that it was an important decision and I wasn't going to make it under pressure in my own house, and Dennis got angry, started yelling that I was ungrateful, that he had accepted me into the family, even though I came from nothing, and that the least I could do was trust his daughter. It was Kristen who finally exploded. She got up from the couch and yelled at her father to shut up, to stop manipulating me, and that she was disgusted by what they were doing. Dennis told her to be quiet, but Kristen looked at me and said, Patrick, you need to know the truth. Valerie has been cheating on you for 6 months. Mom and Dad know about it, and they're trying to get you to eliminate the prenup before you divorce so Valerie can keep half your money. The silence that followed was deafening. You know, one of those moments where you feel like time stops. Valerie started denying everything, screaming that Kristen was a liar, that she was jealous, that she had always tried to ruin her relationship with me. Maria was yelling at Kristen to leave the house, that she was a traitor, and Dennis was red with anger, saying Kristen had just destroyed the family. But I was looking at Valerie, and I could see in her eyes that Kristen was telling the truth. She had that look of panic, you know? Like when someone gets caught in a lie and knows they can't keep lying anymore. I asked everyone to leave my house, immediately. And Dennis tried to stay to talk, but I told him if he didn't leave in 5 minutes, I would call the police. After everyone left, except Valerie, I asked her if it was true. She cried, swore to me it wasn't, that Kristen was lying for reasons she didn't understand, but I didn't believe her anymore. That night I stayed awake thinking about everything, about the last 6 months, about Valerie's behavior, about her sudden interest in eliminating the prenup. The next day, while Valerie was at work, I checked our bank and credit card statements. I found weird charges, dinners at expensive restaurants on days she supposedly had teacher meetings, charges from a hotel in Denver several times, gas purchased in a part of the city where she never went. I hired a private investigator, not something I thought I'd do in my life, but there I was. The investigator confirmed in 2 weeks what Kristen had said. Valerie was having an affair with a guy who worked in finance. They met at that downtown hotel 2 or 3 times a week. The investigator gave me photos, dates, everything I needed. When I confronted Valerie with the evidence, she finally admitted everything, but tried to minimize it, saying it had been a mistake, that she loved me, that we could go to couples therapy and fix it. I asked her if her parents knew, and she said yes, that she had told her mother 3 months ago when she thought I was getting suspicious. Maria had told her not to worry, that they would find a way to get me to eliminate the prenup before things got complicated. The plan was to pressure me for months, make me feel guilty, use the whole family to convince me, and then Valerie would ask for a divorce and take half of everything I had. It was so cold, so calculated, that I couldn't believe it. I hired the best divorce lawyer I could find in Denver and filed the papers that same week. Valerie and her parents went hysterical when they received the notification. Dennis called me like 20 times that day, yelling that I was a son of a bitch, that he was going to destroy me, but I wasn't answering his calls anymore. My lawyer presented all the evidence of Valerie's infidelity, and thanks to the prenup that Dennis himself had forced me to sign 11 years earlier, Valerie had no right to any of my money or properties acquired during the marriage because technically everything was in my name, and we had signed that agreement that said each of us kept what was ours. The divorce was finalized in 6 months, which was relatively quick considering. Valerie didn't receive a single penny from me. She only kept her car and her personal belongings. Her lover, the finance guy, disappeared from her life when he found out she wasn't going to get money in the divorce. Turns out the guy was also married and decided to go back to his wife when everything exploded. Valerie tried to contact me several times after the divorce was finalized, crying, saying she had made the worst mistake of her life, that she missed me, that her parents had manipulated her, but I had already turned that page. One day, like 3 months after the divorce was final, Valerie showed up at my office. She looked different, looked tired, had lost weight, and begged me to give her another chance. She told me she had left her job as a teacher because the school had fired her when they found out about the scandal of her affair with a married man, that her parents barely spoke to her because, according to them, she had ruined their plan to get my money and that she had no one else. I told her no, that part of my life was over, and I called security to escort her out of the building. Kristen contacted me a few months later to apologize for not telling me anything before. She explained that she had discovered Valerie's affair by accident when she saw messages on her phone, and that when she confronted her sister, Valerie begged her not to say anything. Kristen had kept the secret, hoping Valerie would end the affair on her own. But when she saw that her parents were trying to manipulate me with the prenup thing, she couldn't stay silent anymore. I thanked her for telling me the truth, told her she probably saved me from losing everything I had worked to get, and that I didn't hold a grudge against her. I found out from Kristen that Dennis and Maria are in financial trouble now. Turns out they had been counting on Valerie getting money from our divorce to help them with some bad business deals they had made. And when that didn't happen, things got ugly for them. One of Dennis's dealerships closed. Maria had to close her boutique. And according to Kristen, they sold the big house in Boulder, moved to a smaller house. Valerie now lives in a small apartment in Denver, works at a retail store because she hasn't been able to get another teaching job, and I guess she's paying the consequences of her decisions. I'm still running my property management business, which is doing better than ever. I bought a new house on the outskirts of Denver with mountain views. Ironic, right? And I'm dating someone new. A woman I met at a networking event 6 months ago. She's a lawyer, has her own money, and doesn't have a crazy family that comes with the package. Last week we were having coffee on the terrace of my house, and she asked me if I had ever regretted not giving Valerie a second chance. I told her the whole story, everything I just wrote here, and when I finished, she just said, "Sounds like that prenup was the best decision you made without knowing it." And she's right, I guess, because if I hadn't signed that paper 11 years ago, I probably would have lost half of everything I built. Dennis wanted to protect his family's money and ended up protecting mine. The irony of all this is almost poetic.